I tell them it's about to start?
It is starting. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Allegra Davis Hanna. I'm an English instructor at TCC Connect, and I'm so glad to be with you all today to talk about cults and secret societies.
This is Angela Thurman, and I am an economics instructor here at the beautiful Connect campus.
And I'm Misty Mehrtens. I'm the department chair of social sciences, and I somehow got roped into this one.
And we think that we have students from all of our classes who are either joining us live or who will be watching the recording. So shout out to students of Professor Thurman, Professor Wilson Mehrtens, and Professor Davis Hanna. Shout out to our students. It's for you guys. So we do want to let you know that today we will be covering, not in any great detail at all, some kind of sensitive content because we are talking about cults and secret societies. Some of what we discuss will include mentions of manipulation, abuse, controlling behavior. We will mention mass suicide and some bodily injury. So we just want to give everybody a heads up. And if you think that's not something that you can safely watch, then check with your instructor. We do have an alternate plan for you if you don't think this video is for you. But we are going to have a great conversation about cults and secret societies. So let's start by talking about the digital outrage. And I know that you probably hear the word cult all the time. Maybe not every day, but definitely all the time on the internet. Recently, Kanye West was accused of being a cult leader. I'm sure we're going to get a comment about that. A lot of political candidates, when they get a large following that's very dedicated to them, they're said to have a cult. So here's a tweet about Andrew Yang having a cult. Some people make jokes about Canadian politics and cults. So I thought I'd throw in an international tweet for us.
So not just Americans.
And, you know, just general references to people who, different religions, people who do CrossFit. Lots of people throw the word cult out there. Vegans, sometimes we get accused of, they get accused, I'm not a vegan, they get accused of being cult members. Somebody did recently accuse me of being in the cult of Yeti because I have a lot of Yeti products in my house. So
They are pretty cool.
Yeah, so maybe you can join my Yeti fan club. We want to start by saying in discussions about cults, we want to avoid a few things. Jokes are funny. We like jokes, but we want to be sure that we don't disparage anybody's religion, anybody's belief system, spirituality, because it's something that you're not familiar with. We are not here to make jokes about anybody's church or religion, and neither should you. We don't want to use the word cult to dismiss a belief system you don't like. So your church is a cult, my church is the best. We don't want to make any comments like that. We don't want to confuse an avid supporter, so someone who likes Yeti products or someone who likes Apple products. They're not in a cult, obviously, so we don't want to confuse those two things. And while they're very common, we want to try and avoid making jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid because, of course, that is a reference to horrific mass suicides, not really fodder for comedy, especially not in an academic setting.
Agree.
Hold on, they can't hear us at all?
Students, if you can hear us at all, please let us know. I do see a couple in the comments saying that they can't hear us, and we want to make sure that you can before we move on.
I don't see any comments at all.
Yeah, she's got a bunch.
That is the wrong video, bro.
No, it's not.
Just take 1 second. We're going to pause. I think we have two videos happening at the same time. Might be causing some confusion. What's the name of the video you're looking at?
LTD cults.
Just the word cults?
Oh, nope, cults and secret societies.
That's the wrong video.
Okay, let me tell students.
Let me go into YouTube and kill that one. We got too excited and made 2 videos instead of just one. I don't even know.
I've got people that can hear.
Yeah, this is the second video.
Yeah, it's they're just to send them over to the right one.
Yeah, I put a note.
Okay. Okay, so back to the real webinar. Sorry, we had students in the wrong place.
It was like we were in the cult of audio-visual things that don't work.
Yeah. On the slide that says don't make jokes about cults.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
That wasn't funny.
All right, so let's talk about what is a cult. We hear this word a lot. We don't want to make jokes about it, but let's start with a broad, general understanding so that we're all on the same page.
So first off, I want to say,
Okay.
as a historian,
Oh my God.
every new religion starts out being called a cult.
That's absolutely true.
So when we use this term, just be aware whatever belief system you have, at some point, somebody called it a cult.
Absolutely true. Yes.
But in general, it's a non-traditional belief system.
Yes, it's a highly controversial term. Most academics, specifically sociologists who tend to study religion and social groups, don't use the term cult. It's a loaded kind of judgmental term.
It immediately makes you prejudiced against whatever you're about to hear.
Exactly. The word itself tends to be used as a pejorative, which means as an insult or a way to dismiss people. So, oh, you're in a cult. And the other thing to remember is not all cults are religious. And not all new religions are cults. And we're going to talk about both of those things in a great deal of detail today. So the word is very hard to define because all of the definitions have highly subjective terms or words in them. So when we say broadly unusual beliefs, who gets to decide what unusual means? If we say socially deviant beliefs or practices, again, the word deviant is something that people have to define. Another definition that sometimes people use is that they're unnaturally drawn to a person, a living person who is their leader, who makes it challenging to part ways with the cult. And again, unnaturally drawn is subjective. And how challenging is it to part ways with a group is questionable as well.
And sometimes you'll hear that called a charismatic leader.
Yes.
But just know that's pointing to the same thing.
Yeah, charismatic, basically meaning someone who is charming, right?
Yes, and inspires people to follow.
Yeah. So let's talk about when people talk about brainwashing, when people do psychological studies, the technical kinds of limitations on cults: shared commitment to an extreme ideology. The leader embodies the ideology. So if you think about cults, a lot of times they say you start out on the bottom of a path and you're working your way up to enlightenment or betterment, and the leader is supposed to be someone who has completed that path or that ladder or that ascension. Often magnetic or charismatic. There's a strict hierarchy, so new recruits are distant from the higher echelons and the leadership. A high level of commitment, so they require a lot of time, a lot of money, most of the time members are required to recruit new members. They claim to have answers to life's biggest questions, and that's different than claiming to be able to help you navigate life's problems, because religions now help you navigate life's problems, but they don't claim to have answers for all of life's biggest questions. They usually have a recipe for change, which turns this new member into the true believer so that you become more and more like the leader. They have formal and informal systems of control to keep members obedient. Formal systems being penalties, fines, punishment, scolding. Informal systems being embarrassment, social structures, or just kind of giving people the cold shoulder if they're not acting the right way. They don't really have tolerance for internal disagreement, so questioning the leader is not really acceptable. And they don't have tolerance for external scrutiny. They don't stand up to being questioned by people inside or outside of the organization either way. So I know that if you're thinking about all of those things, some of those criteria could be applied to certain major religions. And as Misty pointed out, most religions started out as cults.
Or other people called them cults. The true believers never usually use that term.
Right. So we want to stop and just make sure everyone understands what differentiates a cult and a major religion, because they do have some things in common, of course, shared belief systems and all those things. So a cult separates its members from other people. It's not part of society, and major religions are part of the fabric of society. Cults don't really provide guidelines and resources. They demand control, and they say this is what you must do or you have to do. They have control over relationships, family, finances, and careers, as opposed to saying, we invite your family, which is what most major religions would say. They demand obedience to human leaders, and that's a key difference. And those human leaders are highly persuasive and well rewarded. Most cults operate like pyramid schemes, so members recruit new members, and that helps you rank up in the organization. The more people you recruit, and the more people they recruit, it helps you move farther up that pyramid. And they often target people who are vulnerable, so people who are new to an area, people who are recovering from addiction or the loss of someone. They are targeted because they are vulnerable.
Now, okay, I have a question. Allegra, talk about the possibilities that there are cults within established religions.
There are, absolutely. Yeah, so there are cults that were part of Christian religions. There are cults that were part of most major religions, absolutely.
Because I can read down this list, and I can think of some religions where they do separate some members from society.
So that is a standard practice in some, what we would say, major or recognized religions, yes.
And some religions do have direct control over your relationship, your finances, your careers. They do demand obedience to human leaders.
So one of the differences that they point out a lot is that cults don't honor a family unit, and religions do. So religions teach you to honor your parents or to respect your elders, and cults teach you to follow the leader regardless of what your family would say. And so when we talk about control, we're talking about that leader's control of you as opposed to guidelines for how to live your life within the teachings of our philosophy.
Right. So they're basically making the cult your new family.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's exactly what they're doing. And the other thing we want to say is new religious movements, those are religions that started after 1800, are not necessarily cults, but these are things that often get mistaken with cults or confused in the cult conversation. So new religious movements are considered peripheral to society, and that doesn't mean they're not important to people's lives. It just means they are not culturally dominant. Culturally dominant religions being Baptists in Texas, Catholics, Jewish people of the Muslim faith, those are culturally dominant, right? We see their places of worship, they're part of our cultural conversations. New religious movements tend to be nonviolent, non-dangerous. They're not cults. They have shared belief systems. They have scriptures, texts, meetings, an organizational structure. So this includes things like Christian Scientists, Wiccans, Scientologists, Seventh-day Adventists. These are new religions or new religious movements, but they are not cults. A lot of them did start with charismatic or dynamic leaders or founders, but so did most major religions. So we want to be careful to say these are not, strictly speaking, cults. I know people have their own opinions on Scientology, but we're not going to talk about that today.
I was just going to go there, but okay.
Okay. I knew you were. That's why I said we're not going to talk about it. So if an organization opposes critical thinking, isolates members, penalizes people for leaving, emphasizes special kind of bizarre or extreme doctrines, inappropriate loyalty, again, dishonoring the family, if the group is related to the major religion, so just like what you were talking about, they become like a splinter group and they separate from the church. So if it's something based on the Christian faith, but it is not related to any of the Christian churches. Cults are often dangerous, sometimes physically, and members seem to go missing from their families because they spend holidays and celebration time with the cult and not with their family.
Yeah. So why would you think that the average person would fall?
Oh, that's coming much later.
So,
let Misty tell us about the history part first. Yeah.
So in America, we are kind of uniquely placed to be a breeding ground for religious movements that have been called cults at various times.
It definitely seems like that.
Part of it is because we talk about the freedom of religion and we have the Establishment Clause. So we are much more open and tolerant of other religions than some other countries. But we are not so secular that we are anti-religion. So we have this strong religious impulse and this ability to breed new religions, and also our basic belief in democracy kind of teaches us that any of us could find the true light or the true truth.
Yeah.
So we apply that idea, which is a political idea, to our religious ideas.
I see.
So in the 1800s, we have, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, this is just the three biggest.
Okay.
3 groups that develop: the Shakers, the Oneidas, and the Millerites.
You mean Oneida like my silverware?
I do mean Oneida like your silverware. So the Shakers are a fairly small group. They have a female charismatic leader, which was interesting for the time. The Oneidas are a little bit more interesting. This is John Humphrey Noyes. He's the leader of the Oneidas. And I
have a hard time believing that this man got people to follow him anywhere. But that's my personal opinion.
It looks like Abraham Lincoln.
I think that's just people in the 1800s.
I think they all look like Abraham Lincoln. Okay, go on.
So he creates a community, which is what he called it, a community.
Sure.
In which we had public shaming. So we would sit one person in a circle and we would go around the room and we would all tell them their faults.
Okay.
The only person who never had to do this
was him.
Yeah. He also is going to say that marriage is an institution that divides rather than unites. So all members of the community are married to all members of the community. And that parents should parent all the children. You shouldn't have a special love for your own children.
Takes a village.
So in this situation, we would line up by age, the men on one side, the women on the other side. The men would get to pick their partner for the night, and then the women get to pick their partner, but the older people get to pick first. So much like many of these movements, it doesn't last to the second generation.
So this is a charismatic leader, extreme beliefs, requires devotion, dishonoring the family unit.
Outside of the mainstream culture
outside
at the time.
of mainstream culture. So this is exemplifying all the things that we were just talking about.
Yes.
Except they were also making silverware.
Well, not yet.
Okay.
So when he dies and his son tries to take over, his son is not nearly as charismatic, and so the community starts to fall apart. So they look for a trade, something they can do to keep the community together. They can make silverware. So this becomes the United Silverware Company. Now, by the time it's the United Silverware Company, we are done with the community marriage, and we're all parenting other kids. We've gone back to more normal-ish beliefs. But yeah, that's if you have Oneida Silverware, that's where it came from.
I feel like I should get rid of it now.
I feel like I want to get more of it.
And then there's one more group I want to talk about, and that's the Millerites.
Is this related to the beer?
No.
Oh.
This is related to the Seventh-day Adventist.
Okay.
So William Miller is going to set a date for the end of the world. And he gets followers. They come to his farm. They're all ready.
Is this our first Doomsday Cult?
Kind of, but not really. So the first day comes, and they don't get called up to heaven, so something was wrong. And then they wait again, and they recalculate it, and it still didn't happen. That's called the Great Disappointment, because they're disappointed that the world is still happening.
The Great Disappointment.
And eventually, he is going to realize that he was wrong about the timing, but they do believe that some big change has occurred, and the offshoot of the Millerites that we know today are the Seventh-day Adventists. So this is a group that at the time was labeled a cult, but it becomes a religious movement that looks a little bit more standard. What we can usually say about these movements that develop is they come at times of rapid social or industrial change, and very, very often they are short-lived. They usually only last 1 or 2 generations. So essentially you can hand off power one time, but by the end of that transition, you're usually out of charismatic leaders, and then the whole thing starts to fall apart. If you don't have a central figure to hold it together, it usually won't last. But if it does last past 2 or 3 generations, then it usually becomes more of an established religion rather than what we would refer to as a cult.
Because it becomes more part of the fabric of society, less closed off, less extreme, less separated from the community.
And it's not revolving around one person.
Yeah.
Now we have a doctrine that we can all follow.
Yes. Okay. So I want to talk for a minute about some different kinds of cults, and we're going to touch on probably cults that you guys are familiar with. Not all cults are viciously destructive, but some definitely are. This is a picture of Jim Jones, who started the People's Temple, which eventually led to Jonestown and a mass suicide. So destructive cults are marked by members that kill or injure themselves or others. Their members exhibit drastic personality and or physical changes, probably because they are under the spell of a very malicious or psychopathic cult leader who maybe restricts their eating, maybe requires them to do or say certain things in certain ways. And so it's a very tight, strict control. These people usually all live together in a compound or a house. So it's not like a church that you go to once or twice a week. It's all day, every day, your lived way of life. And there's abuse within the organization.
And I want to make this really clear that nobody joins a group that calls themselves destructive.
Sure.
So when Jim Jones first begins preaching, he's preaching a message of social justice.
Yeah, he's
of
a street
racial
preacher.
equality.
Yeah.
And his church is one of the most integrated churches in his region. He ends up adopting children from different races. So you could join early on and not know what's coming later.
Another example of a destructive cult that you might be familiar with is David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco. I don't know how familiar our students are with it because it did happen like in the 90s. But it is something I think that people talk about, especially in Texas, and that's very similar in the way it ran as a destructive cult in the end. Yeah. Doomsday cults, similar. They are focused on a predicted disaster or apocalypse. Usually their leader or their founder has a prophecy that he or she is espousing, and they have a specific day or time that the world is going to come to an end or some kind of disaster is going to befall humanity, and they are preparing for that doomsday. Oftentimes, these are people who fail to find meaning in other more traditional religions or groups before they join this doomsday cult, and they find a purpose in preparing for the end. That's a way of finding meaning for some people. Many members continue in the organization even after that prophecy doesn't come true. So if we say the world is going to end on May 12th and it's May 13th, surprisingly, a lot of times these members stay in the organization, and the leaders typically have a way of justifying this by saying something like, that was a test. Now your true faith is if you stay, something of that nature. Heaven's Gate is one that might be familiar to you. That was one of the first doomsday cults to recruit people on the internet. And that was a set of beliefs regarding following Halley-Bopp comet into the afterlife, had to do with aliens. They also committed mass suicide. And, of course, the Manson family was a doomsday cult. Also a destructive cult, but it was hard to decide where to put them.
They could fit in a couple different places.
They're all the things.
So one thing about, again, these cults that's kind of interesting, especially with the doomsday cults, is the way the media talks about them after. And it becomes, if you remember Heaven's Gate, well, what were they wearing? And we focus
sweatsuits and Nikes.
Right. We focus so much on that that we kind of lost the fact that these are real people. And same thing with the Manson family, right? It becomes this story in and of itself, and we don't investigate deeper than that.
And there are non-religious cults that a little bit less common. So some things are designed as self-help groups or even multi-level marketing organizations. So NXIVM is an example of that, and we are going to talk in detail about NXIVM in a minute. Some of them are like political radical groups. The most common or most familiar is the Moon Group. And then there are racist or terrorist cults, including ISIS and the KKK. So they're not all religious groups, although most of them have spirituality or shared doctrines. And of course, members of the KKK thought that what they were doing was based on their religious beliefs as well.
Well, as does ISIS.
Yeah,
I
obviously.
would say that most of these, a lot of these groups will sort of twist traditional religious beliefs, and they will interpret them in a different way that sounds plausible if you're not overly familiar, and then they sort of draw people in that way.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about a few cults. Some you might have known about and some you might not. This is one of my favorites to discuss at parties.
How many parties are you going to where you sit around discussing cults?
This is all the parties I go to. I don't go to parties that don't involve these conversations. Thank you very much. So I know what this word looks like, but I've heard 2 podcasts about this family, and both times they refer to them as the Alamos. So I know that looks like the word Alamo, but I think it's Alamo. So Tony Alamo Christian Ministries started by attracting hippies and alienated youngsters. So again, preying on people who are pretty vulnerable socially.
At a time of rapid social change.
At a time of rapid social change. That's Los Angeles in the 1960s, before people really found out that he was a terrible person. In the 70s and 80s, members of his ministry made money for the organization by designing very elaborate denim jackets. I will show you a picture, I promise. And these jackets were sold to celebrities, models, fashionable people, and everyday people, and they made the organization a lot of money. And the young girls who were members of this ministry, most of them whose parents were high-ranking, they were models, but they were made to work from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., modeling the jackets, selling them, packing them up in boxes. So it was one way that they made money. Here's an example of one of their jackets,
which is actually very cool.
And if you Google it, I mean, you can find pictures of Dolly Parton wearing the jackets, Mr. T, Michael Jackson. So they were very popular and fashionable until people realized that this was an abusive and destructive organization. Witnesses at his trial said that he made all of the decisions for his followers, who got married and to whom, what children were taught in school, so he decided all of the curriculum, who got clothes, who was allowed to eat. He made all of the decisions. And even if the girls were out working on selling the jackets and they needed to eat lunch, and they said, can we have $10 for lunch? They had to wait, call Tony Alamo, ask him, can we give them $10? And if they couldn't get a hold of him, nobody got to eat lunch. It was very tightly controlled. He began taking multiple wives in the early 1990s, and the wives became increasingly younger, including in 1994, he married a 15-year-old girl, and that's really when everybody realized what was going on. Do we have a question?
Not yet.
Okay. So let's talk about NXIVM. Are you guys familiar with NXIVM?
Yes. This is a really... you know what? I think it's shocking, because it's so illicit. I mean, the details are very salacious, very entertaining. And so many of the women that became involved in this were, basically like movie stars.
Yeah, and even the ones who weren't famous, I mean, a lot of them had very successful careers. They were very successful. They had families. They were, some of them, vice presidents of corporations. And it's kind of an important reminder that you don't have to be a certain type of person to fall into a cult. Cult leaders are very, very good at manipulating people. And we're going to talk later about how they slow walk you into it so you don't realize that you're in a cult. But it's an important reminder that, yeah, famous actresses, successful people end up doing things they would never have otherwise imagined doing. And again, because it was sexual and there were beautiful celebrities involved, it's a very big news story.
What makes this one interesting academically is that it's almost entirely centered around women, and women end up being both victims and perpetrators.
Well, DOS was, yes.
Right, but I'm saying, like,
NXIVM was for everyone.
Right, but to have a core group of women, that is unusual if you look at these groups as a whole. Yeah. That's not typically what happens.
So NXIVM started as a self-help group. It never purported to be a religion or a replacement for religion. They started by having, seminars in hotel ballrooms where they would, give you advice, kind of like motivational speaking. And they had a program that you paid $200 for the first one. The next one was, $700. And pretty soon you're paying $2,000 for a week retreat to do self-improvement. And most people said the classes were really helpful, that they found new things out about themselves, that they found clarity. That's how they got started into NXIVM. It was a very effective, neutral, non-harmful. It did cost a lot of money, but it also gave them a sense of belonging. And the higher up they ranked, the more important, powerful, and successful they felt. And they also felt like when they recruited people, they were helping them, because NXIVM helped me, so I'm helping you by bringing you into the organization. Recently, this is their leader, Keith Raniere. He went on trial. Jurors found him guilty of racketeering and sex trafficking, which I think is probably something everybody's familiar with. Most of the trial focused on that secret sorority within NXIVM, which is called DOS. I can't remember what those letters stand for. But women were branded, had starvation diets, assigned to have sex with Mr. Raniere, basically at his command. And they were required to recruit new new women into the organization.
Yeah, I think that this is interesting, like Professor Wilson mentioned, is the fact that the women were basically, they were for sure being abused, but yet at the same time they were willing to go out and recruit other women to experience the same degradation and abuse that they were enduring. So that's amazing. And the other thing is that a lot of these women were married. Their husbands were also a part of this organization. And I find it fascinating the way, if you ever read any of this, the way that it was spun as it wasn't really a choice that the women had. This was just something that they had to do. And the husbands were like, well, if you got to do it. And no one ever stood up to him.
Mm-hmm. And it took one of them. I mean, a lot of things happened to break this open, but it basically took the members saying, something bad is happening. We have to do something about it.
We have a student asking if you know what NXIVM stands for.
No.
Okay. DOS is a Latin phrase. I'm gonna butcher this. So Allegra, if you want to try.
I don't see it. Oh, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which is master over slave women. So very cool. And as proof of their commitment to him, the women had to hand over what he called collateral, which was usually either nude photographs or letters with embarrassing secrets. And so basically it was like, if you don't do what we say, then we will release these items. And it's not that they were dumb and they're like, sure, have some nude photographs of me. At the time, it was sold to them as a way of showing commitment to your self-improvement. So if you're committed to this organization, if you're committed to improving yourself, you will show your commitment by giving us something that makes you vulnerable. And so that's how it was explained. And then, of course, it was very clear to them afterward that it was just a way to blackmail them. He was kind of the ruler in this little mini universe, and until the trial, there were basically no checks on his power. He was able to control pretty much every aspect of their lives. And one thing I do want to say is there were news reports about NXIVM calling it a cult for a long time before anybody in the organization stood up and did anything. And the reason that happened is because everything gets called a cult. So if there's a news story calling NXIVM a cult, all Keith Raniere had to say was, they call Apple a cult. They call Yeti a cult. Everything gets called a cult. There's nothing, I mean, if the word becomes less meaningful and less powerful, the leaders are able to manipulate the media coverage so that the members don't realize what's happening to them.
Yeah, and there's another thing that he did that actually was pretty brilliant, is right from the start, once you were in the inner circle, which of course, if you're in the inner circle, that makes you just feel like you're really, really part of something. He always taught people that there would be people that would try to bring them down, suppressors that would come and they would try to break down your beliefs and they would try to pull you away. And then that way, he set it up so that when people did leave the organization, he could go, oh, see, those people, they were pulled away by people that are envious of what we have here. So he made it so foolproof so that when anything bad did happen, he already had a label to put on that. And the people were like, yep, that's what happened to those people. So very
and I mean, they really started as what I think he called executive success programs. And he made everyone call him Vanguard.
Okay.
So new members believed that it was a business that gave them coaching and training, and that's kind of how he was able to attract so many successful people. And it was supposed to be a new ethical understanding that enabled humanity to rise to its noble possibility. And that was on their website, which is no longer active. So it went from executive success to branding women and demanding that they have sexual intercourse with him in just a few years. It escalated that quickly. So why do people join cults?
That's a very good question.
I spent most of my time researching this because I already knew a lot of the things about the cults.
Since you go to cult dinner parties a lot.
The basic answer is that cults satisfy natural urges and needs that people have for answers and truths and understanding and self-improvement. They provide belonging. Often new members they call it love bombing, but they are bombarded by love, acceptance, and affection. Who wouldn't want to stay in a place where they were constantly accepted and affirmed? They create this illusion of persecution, just like Professor Thurman was just talking about, which leads to this us versus them mindset. And if you are with a group of people who make you feel safe, who affirm your beliefs, who support you, who love you, and suddenly it's an us versus them, it cements you in the us.
Right. Especially, I think it's especially important to point out that people who feel as though they are already on the edge of society and they feel like, okay, I am whatever it is, fill in the blank. I'm gay, I'm this, I'm that, and my family doesn't accept this. But here's this group, and not only do they accept it, but they love me for it. And they're all just like me. And then you just feel, just like what you said, but it's like you're just in this cocoon. And then by the time you wake up and go, well, that's odd, it's almost like it's too late.
And cult leaders are very skilled at practicing emotional and mental control. They will give people periods of distress and then periods of extreme safety. They use a lot of tactics similar to police detectives on TV shows, trying to get people to give them confessions. So they disorient you, they separate you from your loved ones, they kind of make you question whether you're crazy or they're crazy.
Sleep deprivation is one of these tactics.
Deprivation. And if everyone around you is saying yes, even though your brain is telling you no, eventually you're going to think, maybe I'm the crazy one. If everyone here is saying yes, why am I not, you know? People who are seeking meaning that they couldn't find elsewhere, maybe they tried some religions and they didn't feel like they fit in. And again, the cult members and the cult leaders slow walk this process so that it starts with an executive success class that costs $200, or it starts with a simple meeting in someone's living room, or it starts with a street preacher in Los Angeles, or it starts with an invitation to a social gathering. And it's not like anybody says, hey, do you want to come join our murderous cult?
The other thing all of these tactics are going to do in conjunction with each other is weed out those that are weakly connected or only sort of invested.
Yes.
So that you end up with the core true believers by the end of it.
Yes.
If you're willing to put up with this stuff, you're in.
It's kind of an initiation process.
And Allegra, explain Stockholm Syndrome.
So Stockholm Syndrome is in quotation marks because it has never been clinically proven to be something. But Stockholm Syndrome is a situation in which if you spend enough time in emotional distress with someone, you start to relate to them.
Like Patty Hearst.
Like Patty Hearst, yes.
Supposedly, this is old, but Patty Hearst was kidnapped. They held her for ransom. It ended up that she fell in love with her captor and basically
she started committing crimes with the people who had kidnapped her.
So,
and then when they got her out, there was extensive debriefing, and a lot of people think that she was, again, brainwashing is not a scientific or psychological term either, but a lot of people think that she was just so severely manipulated that she lost her idea of self and right and wrong. So it's all a very slow and deliberate process that is being done to people on purpose. And you might think that only some people are at risk of becoming involved with a cult. And while it's true that cult leaders often look for and prey on the most vulnerable among us, people who have a recent loss, people who are returning from war, people who, as Professor Thurman pointed out, feel left out or neglected socially or from their families, so they're unmarried, they're unemployed, perhaps they're even homeless. They get preyed on, but anybody could be subject to this. There is no one kind of cult member. It doesn't happen to only people who X, Y, or Z. Cult members are not necessarily any dumber, any less aware, any less thoughtful than you or me. And that doesn't mean I think that you're in immediate danger of becoming a cult member, but it does mean that you are not necessarily any different from those people. They are not idiots.
Actually, one of our students has different point that we're not going to discuss right now.
So some of this also involves the specific cults and who they are going to target.
Yes.
So, for instance, the Children of God, which briefly was in Texas in the 1960s, they specifically targeted young men from UT Austin, and they did it through the use of their young women. So it depends on what group we're talking about, which of these tactics is going to work on which people.
Yes. And based on lots of psychological research, cult members are typically psychologically healthy. They may be going through certain circumstances like breakups or upheaval or transition. It could be, as Professor Wilson pointed out, social upheaval and unrest. It just makes a person more amenable to the cult's messaging, but they are not necessarily gullible people, and that's, I think, the wrong assumption that people have. More than 2/3 of them are recruited by a friend, family member, or coworker. So, of course, those are people you're more likely to trust.
And we should say some people are born into these systems.
Oh, yeah.
So that makes it much harder.
Not talking about children, yeah. Indoctrination, again, takes weeks or months. Many new members, again, are trying to fit in with the people around them. And they're like, this is a little bit crazy, but I don't want to rock the boat. I want to make these new friends. I want to be amenable. I don't want to be disruptive. And then the longer they sit there, the more and more susceptible they become. They want to belong, and they are interested in these rewards that are promised to people who join the organization. A lot of times, again, guilt, shame, and fear can be used to manipulate people. So you were talking about public shamings. Sometimes there are blackmail photographs. And really everything around them is discouraging critical thinking. If everybody around you is modeling absolute faith, you start to question whether your doubt is a defect in yourself. And that's another thing that cult leaders are really good at doing, is if you have doubts, if you have questions, if you're criticizing them, they make it seem like no one else has doubts, no one else has questions. That's a Misty problem, right? That's not a good question. That's a sign of your defect.
And if you admit those questions or concerns out loud, you risk losing your community.
Yeah.
Which for a lot of people is the ultimate thing they could lose.
And the longer and longer you're there, the more you believe, I must be wrong because everyone else is in line.
True.
And again, every compromise you make, no matter how small, makes it harder psychologically for you to admit that you were deceived. So the longer you sit there, the harder it is for you to be like, this is all a scam.
True. Well, and then plus that, if it's your family and friends and they're all in it, then you have to go, well, I'm not 100% into this.
But my brother's not an idiot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if I leave, I'm going to be by myself.
Yeah.
So it is. And there's also a lot of cults where they're so manipulative. If you seem as though you're wavering, then they draw you in more and they say, you know what, I think that you might be ready for the next step, which is even more, in the inner circle.
So in case any of you are saying, not me, could never happen to me, Margaret Thaler Singer was one of the foremost researchers on people who belonged to cults or who had been brainwashed. She interviewed and worked with Patty Hearst and many other people. And she basically said the public takes care of their fear by thinking only crazies and stupid people wind up in cults. I've interviewed over 4,000 ex-cult members. There's no one type of person who is vulnerable. She says people just don't want to admit that they could be influenced or manipulated. They want to preserve a myth that other people are weak-minded and easily influenced, but they are strong-minded. But she says that's a fantasy, right? Most manipulation is very subtle and very covert. No one comes to you and says, join my cult or I'm going to beat you up, right? It's not...
And no one's going to say, join my cult.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Come
not
see
that...
my church.
It's not that obvious. Right.
I mean, even if you look back at the Nazis, there were a lot of, I'm hesitate to say this, but there was a lot of good people that were in the German army that didn't necessarily even know the whole concept, but they felt like they had to go along to get along because it was their country, it was their family, it was their honor, and then but afterwards, I always wonder about how if you are in something like this and it all falls apart, what's left? What are those people? How do you live with yourself?
It's very damaging, and that's actually a great segue, because even if the cult is not physically dangerous, even if no one is hurting you or asking you to kill yourself or asking you to hurt other people, it is still dangerous, because if you stay in the organization, you lose a lot of critical thinking and developmental skills. And if you leave or the cult disintegrates, then you are kind of left with this period of nothingness. Mm-hmm. Most cults don't lead people to their deaths, and most cults aren't murderous. The Manson family is not a common occurrence, obviously. But everybody in a cult loses freedom of thought, speech, and association. And so it's damaging to your relationships, to your family, to your friendships, to your emotional health, your psychological growth. Children who are raised in cults are especially affected, of course, because they have developed their entire worldview while in a cult. So they grew up with the absence of critical thinking and personal growth. They are deprived of developmental activities because they probably aren't allowed to socialize very much with people outside of the organization. So they don't have the normal friendships and socialization that children typically do. And many cults, even if they're not abusive, create these power dynamics that at the very least are harassment, but probably are more like verbal abuse. So they're dangerous for everyone involved in them, regardless of whether they are the dangerous, destructive, murderous cults.
Good point. So with that said, what would be the appropriate thing to do if we felt as though our loved one, or I think It's hard to say what if I feel like I'm being sucked into a cult, because I don't think I would. I don't think I'd see that. But if I felt like someone that I loved, or even that was just a casual friend and acquaintance, and they didn't seem to hear reason, what would be the step?
So you got to remember that believing in something or belonging to something should not come at a super high cost, meaning you shouldn't have to lose your family, your relationships, your friendships in order to believe or belong to something. And anything that causes or requires you to lose relationships is something that you should question very seriously. No organization can solve every problem or answer every question, and if they say that they can, then you should question them. And again, I know major religions tell us they can help us solve our problems, they can help us navigate our questions, but your major religions, they don't say we have a quick, easy fix for all life's problems. We have a path that, solves everything. No one should require of its members the sacrificing of what you think is right and true in order to serve your leader. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you know something is right and someone says, well, do the wrong thing because it benefits the group, it benefits our leader, it's what he's asking you to do, that's something that you have to question. You have to be aware of times that you are particularly susceptible. So times of great change, great loss in your life cause you to become more susceptible. And you have to guard your friends and family members, especially when they are going through periods when they are particularly susceptible. Now, that said, there's not a cult recruiting you on every corner. I don't want anyone to think that this is something they need to be in immediate danger of. But the other thing that we really have to do is stop talking about cults the way that we maybe do. We have to distinguish between the joking use of the term cult, like when we refer to people who like a certain brand name of water bottle, and the reference to a potentially dangerous, potentially lethal group. We can't make assumptions about those who have been taken advantage of, so we can't assume, if you join that group, then you're an idiot. And we have to avoid dismissing religious or spiritual practices you don't understand or aren't familiar with as saying, you're in a cult because your church is weird to me. And again, falsely labeling things as cults makes the meaning of the word degrade and makes it harder for people to understand that they are actually in a cult. And that's what happened to people who were in NXIVM. Everyone called it a cult, but everyone calls everything a cult. So that word wasn't very meaningful to them, and it took people a lot longer to realize what was really going on.
Yeah, so basically, if you feel as though, one, if something sounds too good to be true, it is. And two, if people are asking you to do things that go against your belief system and make you feel uncomfortable or embarrassed or humiliated, then the answer needs to be no. Because if someone wants you to be in, let's just say, their friend group, and they say, by the way, you have to take this drug, you have to have sex with this person, you have to give us X amount of money, okay, that's not typically what your new best friend would do. So be aware, but it is very insidious.
It is. It absolutely is.
I think, Dad, just one more thing.
Yeah.
Don't look at actual good work a group does and says, well, they do this, so they can't be a cult.
Yeah.
Because, again, Jim Jones fed the homeless.
Yeah.
He had a lot of outreach programs, and people said, well, it can't possibly be a cult, or he'd be completely evil.
Yeah.
So sometimes even those groups do good things, but look a little deeper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Good point.
So if you are very interested in the subject, or if you just want to know more about a particular group, we have some resources here for you to check out. There's a video called Holy Shit, We're in a Cult. And that's about one of the non-religious kind of self-help group cults that we were talking about earlier. There's a TED Talk called I Grew Up in a Cult, It Was Heaven and Hell. And that's about a girl who grew up in one. She was there as a child. Her grandfather started it, and it's really fascinating. It is extremely emotional because she talks about some things that happened to her. If you want to know more about the Oneidas, there's an episode of Nice Try. It's episode 4 of that podcast. It's called Oneida, and it's all about the silverware making multiple marriage having
sex cult.
There are 2 seasons of a podcast called The Truth About True Crime. That's actually hosted by Amanda Knox. And the first 2 seasons are about cults. The first one is about Jonestown, so that's Jim Jones. And the second is about the Alamos, so the people who made the jackets. There's a Heaven's Gate podcast. And I just want to say the founder of Heaven's Gate and I went to the same college, so not at the same time. Marshall Applewhite.
Oh, that's weird.
And all the things I know about NXIVM, I learned from the Uncover podcast, season 2, Escaping NXIVM, and it follows one of its members who defected and really shed light on the whole subject. So those are all good places to go. If you want credible first-hand accounts and good information, if you Google cult or if you look up crazy conspiracy theories on YouTube, you're not guaranteed to find credible, valuable information. So these are all accounts taken from first-person accounts or from scholars and research. So these are credible places to get information about cults.
So we have one more webinar in this series. But before we talk about that, let's talk about how you get credit for this one.
Because that's what you're here for.
I assume.
Or
not Professor Thurman. They're all here to expand their minds.
Or because you're interested in cults, because who's not?
There you go.
So give us about 5 minutes and then come back and look at our page. Click on this video and we will have the link in the video description. It's a Google form. You'll click on it. You'll fill it out. What we need from you are your name, your student ID, your professor's name. You should know that by now.
And it's okay if it's more than one professor. If you're in my class and Professor Thurman's class, put both. Yeah.
And then answer the questions. That link's active for 48 hours, so we take it down on Friday afternoons. And then your answers are sent to your instructors, and that's how you get the credits.
And lots of instructors don't give you the credit until the end of the semester.
And because we're here at the end, I want to ask you guys in the last question, what do you want to tell the presenters? If there is a topic you would maybe like us to discuss next time in the spring semester, we're about to start putting together that series. So we're really interested in your thoughts, what you guys want to know about, what you want to hear.
And a lot of our a lot of our webinar topics have been based on student recommendations and conspiracy theories that we did last semester was a student recommendation. So if you think there's a subject that we can delve into in our webinar series, let us know.
Our next and last webinar in this series, Beyond Digital Outrage, is going to be From Outrage to Action. So we're closing out talking about how you can go from reading something online to producing meaningful action in that area, and particularly how to do that with either founding a nonprofit or working with a nonprofit.
So what if I only want to be angry on the internet and I don't want to have any actual change?
Then you need to get a Reddit account.
Done. All right, everyone, thanks so much. If you have questions or feedback for us, other than that we started late, for which we're
very sorry.
Appreciate your patience. But if you have any other comments for us, please do let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.